Alexander, and we're on the move to share the amazing things happening within the Division of Fine Arts here at Howard University. Let's head over to Jasmine Tilford to get a sneak peek of the opening season production of Jonkonnu.
Thanks, Cameron. Currently, an exclusive interview is happening right now with director, Professor Nicole Brewer, and playwright Mark A. Williams. This interview is being conducted by former Howard University professor Otis Ramsey Zoe. Let's get right into it.
Excellent, thank you for joining us. I am Otis Ramsey Zoe, and we are in conversation today with Nicole Brewer and Mark A. Williams. This is the director and playwright for Howard's upcoming production of Jonkonnu. I think that, and did I say that right, Mark? Mm-hmm. Jonkonnu, thank you. I think perhaps a great place for us to start this conversation about the work. Mark, I'd like to begin with you. If you can, please tell us a little bit about the title of the play. What is Jonkonnu, or what is the audience intended to get from that title?
Well, Jonkonnu refers to a celebration, I believe it initiated in the Bahamas, but there are different renderings spread out through the Caribbean. But it was essentially during the slave trade. Slaves were given 3 days off, what the British called Boxing Day. And so there was a director named Tracy Jenkins who approached me in, I think it was 2006, to maybe do an original piece around that. And so it morphed into it being these 3 days off, but those 3 days were the seeds for leaving the plantation and going into the mountains. And it somewhat mirrors the Maroon narrative in Jamaica, where slaves ran up into not the Blue Mountains, and they essentially were able to withstand the British from coming in and reclaiming property. So it was sort of mirrored after that. So that was its genesis.
Excellent, thank you. And so that we can alternate a bit, Nicole, if you will, given that we can't assume that the audience will enter this play with a sense of what Jonkonnu is, or with an awareness of the world, can you describe briefly how you elected to drop the audience into the world? How is the audience introduced to this play?
I think the experience of Jonkonnu happens before they even walk into the space. And so, we're inviting them to bring ancestors that they want to honor and they remember into the space. They'll be asked to write names down on leaves and to enter the space to hang those leaves on a tree. And those leaves will live there for the entirety of the run. We are also inviting them in the beginning before it performs with a version of Dominique Morrissey's playwrights agreements of just here's the experience of it. So instead of being in your brain to analyze it and putting up that obstacle of actually opening up and having an emotional intelligence about what is happening in front of you, we are inviting you from the jump to be present and to honor that we are honoring our ancestors. And I love that Mark has described his work as a dialogue with God. And so how do you enter into that space is very much on the forefront of my mind and has been throughout the creation of this particular production.
Excellent. And it's interesting because I said that we might alternate, but what I realized that I want to really create here is a sense of conversation, right? So that there's this free-flowing thing that's happening where I'm not necessarily guiding, I'm just here inquiring. And so one of the things that I hear from both of you right now is this sense of suspension, both in terms of what the ritual asks of its participants, right? It happens somewhat outside of normal time. There's 3 days in which the individuals are given an opportunity to revel, to celebrate, to remember, to commemorate in a certain kind of way. And so then it represents a kind of suspension from the toils of daily life. But that also then we are inviting the audience also to suspend when they enter, right? And to enter into a space of timelessness. So perhaps, if you will, can you reflect on the way in which the play creates a sense of timelessness?
Well, it's a very good question because that really does undergird the play itself. I don't think people, when you talk about the transatlantic slave trade, I don't know that it registers as something that's real all the time. Because it was so horrific that the notion of this being a real narrative, I think is it's almost its own suspension of disbelief. So what Nicole did, because in the initial rendering of Jonkonnu, it went up at the Lincoln Theater, 600 people, and as playwright, I have my ego, just like everybody else. And so 7 minutes standing ovation, and so as an artist, I got what we want. But I was telling the cast that Nicole assembled is that it's almost logical and an honor for it to be at Howard, not just because of its institutional history and capacity, but it's that what Nicole has set up is a space where you can't hide. At the Lincoln, you're supposed to settle up not nice into your 1,200 seat theater, whereas what she's created is a space where there's no hiding, which to me is essential for the audience to get that this is in fact not suspension at all. It's actually the very, very opposite. It's so real that it's almost unbearable, and that's what we want. That's as playwright, that's what I wanted. What I didn't know because we never know what we need to know until we know it. That this is really what I wanted in terms of this play. That the audience, you can't. There's no place to hide and sort of rest from the narrative because you literally are there. And when Nicole, you talk about the staging of it, even that, with these soundscapes that she's created, it's you're immersed in the narrative. So it's a really interesting question because it's really it's not there's no fourth wall. As an artist, as a director, that's how I roll. In terms of the fourth. But with this, it even eliminates that sort of construct because there shouldn't be. Because of how horrific the narrative is, but then how beautiful it is.
I would say for the sense of timelessness, if the audience can relate and parallel those atrocities with today's atrocities and how that is manifesting itself and these really huge themes that Mark brings up. So, and it's just layered as you go through it and on it. So there was, for me, these initial themes of individualism versus collectivism, right? And how that shows up. And you can see, as he's constructed it, those people who choose individualism end up dead, injured, hurt in some way. Those people who had faith in collectivism and how we stand up together were able to achieve something. So there's the love story that happens. Every single character that has words is entrenched in some love story of some kind. And so how that manifests itself. Then there is, of course, that narrative that we cannot get around that's timeless for me, which is white bodies and black bodies, and how the centering of this world that we're presently in is very much centering white experience, white life. And so then what that power shift looks like as we go through the play of a white man's, space getting smaller, and then a man's space expanding until we get to these really poignant, beautiful lines, which is "I is a man," and the breath of that.
Right.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And also a word about the timelessness because it's also an extremely important part of. If you think about the sort of when we took Jonkonnu to Senegal, and we took the whole ensemble to Gorée Island, which is one of the slave forts in West Africa. And as you go through the fort, there's a place where the women were held, the children were held, and then there's a cutout. It's made out of stone. There's a cutout, a rectangular cutout, and that's called the door of no return because that was the last place the West African went before they went on the gangplank and boarded the ship. Now, if you think about that journey, in the hull of a ship where there is no light, but even the sense of time, because the European construct of time is Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, but that's not the African sense of time. Certainly not the Caribbean and transplanted. So, to me, the timelessness has to do with it's fascinating to me because the power of the West Africans that ended up in North America and Brazil and the Caribbean is how time did not defeat people, right? And that's now paralleling it to its contemporary relevance because, as artists yourselves, unless art is fluid and salient and contemporary, then what use is it? So to me, it's also looking at the prison system, because that's the horror of the prison system. Is that, if you talk to folk who've been incarcerated, you have to do the time literally. So you can't be defeated by the time. So I would parallel those things in that the power of the narrative is how time is something that cannot defeat. And that a line in the play is a year in the line of God get cut because of the transatlantic slave trade. So that's also falls into the sense of time, because that connection to God, that was the white man's burden, is that you needed to give these not even human people God because they didn't have it. Well, it's absurd, because if you look at the religious systems in West Africa, they are massive. We deal with the Yoruba in part in Jonkonnu, but that sense of connection to God is really what undergirds the narrative, because God and time is connected. I don't know if that makes any sense.
Completely. Yeah, one of the things actually that makes me think about then, particularly centering the way in which the timelessness evokes this sense of history, but also the present moment, is also then the way in which the play is simultaneously then engaged in a sense of timelessness, but also in repetition, right? There is a sense of things happening not for the first time in the midst of what I'm calling the suspension, and I think is my way of getting at a language of timelessness, right? Where action happens, movement happens, things are happening, but it seems that time isn't moving in the way in which we expect time to get at. In the same way that I guess when I talk about like suspension in terms of the audience's experience, then it is a way of hanging the burdens that they're carrying in at the door, and then entering into the ritual. Because I guess the other thing that I think about with this play is its sense of ritual, and the way in which it is staged then is that the idea of an audience observer, that sort of distinction then kind of goes away. And so then what we have are sort of not spectators, but all participants sort of in the space, and also a part of this ritual, right? Such that Jonkonnu is not just a thing that happened, it is also a thing that kind of continues to happen, right? And the other way in which I guess I keep thinking about suspension, and this is so, I keep wanting to come back to the notion of Jonkonnu itself, because its origins are so disputed, right? The way, and then in which we can kind of look at, well, there's the West African, and then this French idea that fits, and then there's this English idea that fits, and then there's the way in which it's kind of been misidentified in this kind of English-speaking imagination. I was going to say American, but I think that when people went down to the Caribbean, they also misunderstood it. But I'm thinking about moments where it's been described as a version of Mardi Gras, which it is not. But what the way in which, why it was permitted, I think, is that the slave masters kind of started to see this as an opportunity for the people that they held in bondage to kind of blow off steam, to kind of relax, to release, while not at the same time acknowledging its revolutionary potential, right? The way in which it is a space that carves out, that kind of turns the world upside down, where within Jonkonnu, in the white man's imagination, this is the only space in which you get to practice freedom. But the sort of fallacy in that is this assumption that those people needed you to give them a day in which to feel free and to inhabit freedom. And so I think that it's that kind of contradiction that I'm also interested in, the way in which it may be understood as one thing, but it is actually something else that's much more deeper and more complex, and that connects us to memory and repetition and all of those things, and to God and God's time, right?
That's well done. I mean, I always, in my own classes, refer to after the Vietnam War, the Afghanistan, the Iraq War. There's always this sort of notion of post-traumatic stress disorder.
Mm-hmm.
How do you survive that? You being mortars and shells and go back to Subway and have a sandwich. But there's been nothing diagnosed in terms of the post-traumatic stress disorder for the descendants of slaves. And what's even fascinating to me also for what you're saying is but then that presupposes that the white people didn't have a post-traumatic stress disorder.
Yes.
Because there's a trauma in being oppressed, but then there's a trauma in oppressing and not even understanding the nature of that. And I think that's part of the sort of psychosis and even sort of schizophrenia of that's chattel slavery produced, if that makes sense. Because my thing is always, this little bitty country, England, controlled, damn near the planet. But then they had to have. Well, my thing is to understand. If you have to get in the head of the plantation owner, which is part of the challenge in this play, was for me to write Rogers, the plantation owner, because everybody in this room, if you had the chance to own slaves, I'm pretty sure you would, because of how politically, economically, and legislatively powerful it was. So for me, it's always to try to understand the psyche also of that person and the persons that owned people as well, and how they rationalize it. Because I don't know how else to say this, but being white it has to be a constant rationalization. You know what I'm saying? I got to rationalize, because otherwise you might think I'm a bad person. You know what I'm saying? So those rationalizations to me are what fascinates me, about the condition of being white. And now in the universities across the country, now you have white studies.
Right.
White studies. I love that.
And
man.
sometimes
hey,
let's
sit around and think about what this means. You understand what I'm saying? That's like the ultimate privilege right there.
Yeah.
Let's have whiteness studies. It's like, no, man, let's have hate studies. You know what I'm saying?
But, you've touched on so many things there, and I want to kind of lift up some of those items. Like when you describe the post-traumatic stress of slavery and sort of traumatic encounters, I actually want to begin by inquiring around the notion of post-traumatic. Who says that we are post or after the stress? Right?
Agreed. That's right. Because really, you're talking about sort of the genetic trauma. But that's why August Wilson was my man, because he said the notion of blood memory is just that's spot on.
Yeah.
So that sort of interrogates the post-traumatic, because it's like there's a memory that lives in blood. All we know something that we don't even know that we know. You know what I mean?
Definitely. And then the other thing, of course, when you talk about the construction of whiteness, it makes me think about, I had a conversation with Robert O'Hara, and it was when he was talking about his play, Insurrection Holding History, and he said, white people sitting on a porch, sipping lemonade, scared that folks were going to rebel against them too. That too is slavery, right? That's a certain type of captivity to be there and to kind of understand your positioning in relationship to those other people, right? Such that slavery isn't like just this one thing. But then, of course, the other question I think about the sort of economics of slavery as an institution that is social. That is actually more economic than like social or moral, right? It becomes a part of that kind of rationalization that you described.
Exactly. Sugar was the most profitable export. Those cane fields are part of what gave that British Empire the power, and the cane fields and the bodies that were bought and sold as a result of it. So if you remove the morality, you look at just hard economics. It was spot on in terms of a strategy, and then the great rationalization, which is why God is essential to this play, is that the rationalization of you need to do this, you need to be my son, because I'm going to give you God. I'm going to give you 3 days to be free. You're absolutely right. Is that you're so arrogant that you think you can give people a couple of days and say you're free today?
Right. And so that actually brings me to think more about the specific choices embedded in this production. And Nicole, I'm interested if you want to talk a little bit about your vision for lifting this play off the stage, off the page, and then setting it into a space for the audience, because I think about the way in which the text has this remarkable, it presents a remarkable kind of elasticity then in terms of its movement, the potentiality for its sonic and aural soundscapes, its potential for visual and things of that nature. So would you like to talk a little bit about the world in which you've created in the space and using the actors?
Yeah, I think for myself, this was an opportunity to fully use my conscientious theater training methodology. And so just a little briefly about that, we started this play in with our table work, which was we didn't actually read Mark's play. We deconstructed his play and took moments and then embodied those moments and we privileged emotional intelligence versus an intellectual understanding. So from the jump, it was very conscious on my part to create space that didn't continue to propagate or center white supremacy, even if white people were not involved. And so it was about taking time to also set up how we were going to be with each other in the space with session agreements and checking in and defining those and having the cast to come back and say what those were. It was about addressing trauma in a communal way. So there's a scene in which a 13-year-old girl is raped. Well, normally the thing is, okay, you're cast in that role, go get that information and then come back and then I can work with whatever you brought. But especially on a college campus where the percentage of females who will be sexually assaulted and or raped is astronomical, I thought that reckless to give one person that responsibility. And so we used the floor of ETS, we used chalk on the floor, and we explored sexual tensions, and people added to other people's stories. And for rape, we used these very large, the bigger version of the 3x5 cards. And I had people just rape. What does that word mean to you? Or what does that invoke in you? And they were able to draw or write or whatever. And then I had other people go around and look at those cards and then add to, so it was conversations that were being had that didn't privilege sitting around, looking at each other, being analytical and separate. So that was huge for me in the how do we create, and then where do these moments then build and find their ways into the show. So it has from the jump been a co-creation. It's a destructuring of the hierarchy. I provided a framework, these wonderful people filled it in, and it was literally giving folks the space to be brilliant in the way that they felt they needed to be brilliant for the production. There was no shaming involved in this production. People have jobs, they have things they need to do. Every time they came into the space, they were welcomed, no matter what time it was. You know, we didn't have an off-book date, which I'm kind of still sitting in. Maybe that was a regretful moment, but but really trusting that, and this is a quote that I got from Emergent Strategy, a book that I read for another thing about trust. If you trust the people, they become trustworthy. So really privileging that. And then all of the stuff that comes with that. We watched a documentary, The Rape of Racy Taylor together. As a cast, we discussed that. We check in with each other at the beginning of every single rehearsal. So it's relational and not transactional, and we don't talk about the show. It's literally about like, where are you in space? And so tying all of that back to what this production was and how I wanted people to experience it, I told our actors that if this show would be successful, if the audience was not just uncomfortable, but able to see the ways in which they have been complicit in holding up areas of oppression within our own community. So that could be how we judge people who don't have all these degrees. It could be the people who we see on the corner that we no longer see the systems that put them there, but see the person and then charge them as, a character default. It's all the ways that we buy into pulling yourself up by your bootstraps, which is a complete and utter fallacy and lie, and more of that. So this for me was definitely about how do we reclaim, how do we remember. So if we go back to thinking about what's in the blood and the DNA, how do we remember all of the things that were taken from us? How do we own that? And how do we reconnect into our own minds of God, which will all be different. And I feel like we all got some like places in the chain where it's not quite where it needs to be. So I don't know, did I answer your question?
Oh, indeed. Well, it's interesting because one of the things that I hear in the answer that you've offered is the way in which your process also reflects the experience that the audience, and I really should find a better word for audience, right? Because they're really like participants in the ritual. They are attendees to the ritual, right? The way in which you're decentering of the individual towards a sense of the collective and how the collective moves really does mirror the play and what the play offers, right? I'm struck by the way in which oftentimes what I remember the play, and I have to sort of put that in brackets because I only encountered the piece last night through a rough run through. But that the beauty and dynamism of his staging really did come out, even in a run-through. And I was really struck by that and by your work, and also by your work, Mark. And so it makes me think about the I is displaced by the we. That is another way in which the play is experienced, right? Such that even when we get to the character Winsome, the we in the I is articulated through an encounter with her mother who speaks to her mother whom she did not have the opportunity to meet because she perished while she was a baby. And yet in this encounter we find that sort of I, that we in the I, that Winsome does not exist kind of on her own, that she is an articulation or a manifestation of her mother. She is the embodiment of her mother's dreams and desires, and she walks the earth in that way, not just herself, but kind of carrying the ancestor within her. Kind of is another way in which I think about how segregation gets articulated throughout the play, right? The way in which we have Kofi, and then we have Kofi's child, that we see, and so, and there's part of me that I kind of hesitate because of the way in which, like, spoilers, and I don't know how much to say without revealing too much about the experience, but that it is a play where the I gets de-emphasized because I am not I am we. Yeah. There's an usness about how we experience the play, but also the story that's happening in front of us, right? So that process, it's striking to think about that process, but also the work itself.
And the thing about ancestors is, I mean, you have young people here who I wonder about to what extent, when you bandy the word ancestors, it doesn't sound like a bunch of old heads talking about that ancestor stuff. Yeah. Right. But for I think for both of us, it really is about the sort of reality of that. That's not hyperbolic or exaggeration, but that really is lineage, and that to me is one of the most essential takeaways. In South Africa they have the expression the Ubuntu, which is the I in we, but that's not localized to South Africa. That's the whole. Because look, if you had to share a ship with folk, that were from different worlds within a continent, that's where it started. Completely. Right there.
Yes, that image makes me think about the way in which that we-ness is something that happens even if we think about the process of inhalation and exhalation, right? We are breathing in the same air, so something of you leaves and I take that in, right? And so to be then in a ship, just breathing in and becoming one. Yeah. Your comment about lineage actually reminds me of something else that's worth citing. If you can talk about trees or the tree, how the tree figures into this production and both sort of thematically and also visually.
Want to talk about the trees?
No, you're good.
Okay, you should talk about the trees. Okay, so there's 2 trees that happen. There's more than 2 trees. There are trees that are created with ropes, and there's an actual tree that Greg Jackson, the prop master, made for the space. And so the one that Greg made is so important for people to understand that ancestors are those that are gone, period. That a Trayvon Martin ancestor, you know? And it was so important for me, and I'm getting emotional because I'm an alum of this department, but it was so important for me to call into that space Mike Malone, to call into that space Reggie Ray, and to call in that space Dr. Carol Singleton, to call into that space and know that I am because they were. And that I'm able to tithe into this community because of the love that they showed me that didn't always show up as love. but it was. And how in a state of lack, they found ways within this space to fill you with abundance and for preparation. And it needed to be more than me than just calling out a name. It needed to be people experiencing and seeing the totality of the leaves as they will grow over the run of the show. So for me, that's what that was. And also, you've been to some places where folks invoke the ancestors and they ask you to call the ancestors out, and then people are like, and then they might be like, Maya Angelou, and it's like, yeah, she's great, but I'm talking about your lineage in a specific way that doesn't put an obstacle to you or someone you may have, admired but not actually been in relation with. How do we bring them into the space? So that's what that tree is, and I'm really looking forward to watching it bloom or open or whatever that word may be as those leaves get there. The other trees happen as a way to envision ETS in a way that I've never experienced it, which is vertically, because it's a very low ceiling. And really going back to the line of God and just how beautiful that was for me, and the narrative of rope and black bodies, this narrative of not playing to actual realism in any way, but finding the actual theatrical narrative of any sort of element and what that can invoke and inspire in the audience as well as in the actors. And so there's a large tree that happens with ropes, and that one for me lives there because of the roots that you can see, and more importantly, who's holding on to those roots, who's nourishing those roots. So I'm hoping that people won't think too hard on it, but they'll be able to have that inside of them when they think about those trees in this production, in this space.
Yeah, and at the same time, as you were describing the tree, it makes me think also of potential, the way in which the roots are reaching down, but also the branches are reaching up. But then it also makes me think about the intelligence of trees, for the way in which their reach is in proportion to kind of their environment and what the sun offers, what water is available. But that also what we see of the trees, there's more beneath the tree than what we see, and so there's something of that that I think about. I too think about, one of the things I'm struck by is just that the production is happening in a space that is named after Al Freeman Jr., right? Which is, another one of those sort of ancestors who has come before, and so it makes me think about the way in which the gifts of our ancestors really, truly are all around us, and that one of the ways the play invites us to experience that perhaps is through a type of surreality. And what I'm calling surreality also comes from Pachan's definition, where he suggests that surrealism or surreality is the realism that we can see combined with that which we cannot see, the stuff of dreams and things of that nature, right? Such that then the encounter of the play then is not in any way rooted in a strict encounter with realism, right? That there is a type of meta or heightened or extra theatricality, which we might call something that is beyond the real, which in itself, though, is more real than the real we see alone. It is an invitation to see behind the real.
Yeah, that's you know, the reason I became a playwright was because of a man named Joseph A. Walker.
Yes.
Who was the chair of the theater department here. Excuse me, this play, The River Niger, you know, is stunning. But there's a line where John goes, fiction is more real than reality.
Yeah.
Because the problem with fiction is it's misnamed because it suggests something made up. But if we talk about our lives, they're not real. You know what I'm saying? Because of how unbelievable some of the things that happen to us is. So fiction, you can make sense in fiction, whereas in life you can't, right? Because you have to move through something. You have to move through pain, move through despair, move through whatever. Whereas in fiction, you can stop it and make sense of it. So, and I always, this is not directed to you, but I always love like magical realism and surrealism. It's like my father saw somebody levitate in Guyana. Yes. Do I believe him? Hell yeah, I believe him. Meaning that the notion that, you know, things like voodoo and Obeah, which is in the you know, the Western construct is, oh, this is some made up stuff, right? But I'm like, sorry, man, your boy Jesus, you rose from the dead.
Right, right.
And the whole system, you know, was formed around that. So don't call my grandmother's, you know, the things she was able to do, voodoo or Obeah, or, you know, and it all connects to that sense of time and God. Because there has to be a definition of time and a definition of God. But when you're talking about, again, the transatlantic slave trade, that can't be real. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
And that's circling back to what Nicole has done, is that it takes this notion of the real away. And it's more that how we share a collective experience.
Yeah.
So the transatlantic slave trade was a collective experience, but so was the way it was survived.
Yes. This is actually probably going to feel like a tangent, but when you just now evoked realism, the things that people see and encounter that some people don't believe, which of course makes me think about sight, God, timelessness, it immediately makes me go to fugitivity. And I guess what I think of why I'm making that connection has to do with escape or strategies of escape, right? And I put God in relationship to fugitivity for the ways in which an idea of God escapes its own limitations, right? Such that a notion of God cannot necessarily be summed up or contained or described by our kind of like, in our limited vocabulary, right? So too does time, like how we think about time. I forget which of the planets it is, but one of the planets, because of the way in which it revolves and rotates, its day is longer than its year, right? And so it kind of makes me then think about the way in which we are constructing an understanding of time in order to kind of order our own lives and our experiences, which kind of then makes me go back, reflect on your observations about fiction then, right? That fiction is a narrative that we tell about an experience which we are calling somehow unreal, but that at the same time, it really is kind of like a narrative, it's a story that we tell. Well, we actually exist only in story to a certain extent, right? And as much as I think about your name is a story, right? That my mother named me Otis, then both tells people who I am, but it also tells me how to be in the world, right? And as much as Otis means he who hears well, he who listens, so then I kind of know who I am and how to be then, because that's what I do. I listen. If I don't know nothing else, I know that my mama named me Otis, and that's kind of what I'm supposed to do, right? So I think about this relationship between fiction as something that's misnamed as a concept that I definitely can ride on, right?
And I think that's beautifully put, Otis, because I like the sort of the conundrum of fugitivity and freedom. I mean, the way I train writers is the goal of all art is freedom. Because we talked about this yesterday, in West Africa there is no word for art.
Yes.
So then if the goal is freedom, and the quote that I always love is Camus, in an unfree society, one must become so free that one's very existence is an act of rebellion.
Yeah.
And that to me is also sort of undergirds this in terms of the, how do you live free? So much so that, you know, you think about the vaunted, the people that we admire most, Jesus, you know, Malcolm X, in terms of their lives, they were so free that just by opening their mouth, by waking up, right?
Yes.
And the ruse of Jonkonnu is that one thinks it's one person, but then you realize it ain't.
Yes. See, there is and an ain't. See, I can go on a tangent with Richard Biden and all those things. But I think that this conversation perhaps is coming to a close. So I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit, Nicole. If you can give us the information about the production, some details, like when, where we can see it.
Okay, so the Division of Fine Arts is putting on Jonkonnu by Mark Williams, and it's going to be opening on October 3rd and running through October 6th, and then the following week it'll we'll be up again at it at October 10th through the 13th. And that tickets can be purchased on the website for the Department of Theater Arts. So yeah, yay!
Excellent.
Come see this show. Come experience this show, actually. It's not about seeing it at all, it's about experiencing it. That's important.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Nicole Brewer is an alumna of the Department of Theater Arts, and this is her first time directing here on Howard University's campus. Now, we want you to remember to pick up your tickets for Jonkonnu and follow the Department of Theater Arts on their social media platforms at HU Theater Arts. That does it for now. Back to Cameron in the studio.
Thank you, Jasmine. What an amazing interview. Make sure that you come out to see Jonkonnu. Performances take place at the Al Freeman Jr. Environmental Theater Space on October 3rd through the 5th and 10th through the 12th at 8 p.m., October 6th and the 13th at 2:30 and 7:30 p.m. That does it for On the Move. Tune in each week to get updated information about the Division of Fine Arts. Thanks for watching.